on YouTube. We have everyone here, and I'll hand it over to Deputy Mayor Thompson.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Phil Thompson. My pronouns are he, him. I've been appointed to serve as one of 11 commissioners on the Racial Justice Commission. And I am sitting here before you in that capacity. Outside of the commission, I serve as Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives for New York. I want to welcome you to our last panel of Transforming Foundations, a series of virtual panels hosted by the Racial Justice Commissioners with guest practitioners and thought leaders about what is necessary to disrupt systematic racism and make racial equity a reality in areas such as health, education, housing, and environmental justice. Each week, commissioners gain ideas to transform the city's foundational laws and policies to embody racial justice and fairness. The Racial Justice Commission has all the powers of a charter revision commission, meaning we will be submitting proposals to change the city's charter, which the public will vote on in 2022. Our proposals will represent structural change to move the city toward our vision of racial equity, a city where the worth, talents, and contributions of all people in society are valued and recognized. Our chair likes to say our work is to implement critical race theory in practice. A city where race is not the determinant of economic, political, social, or psychological outcomes, as it neither confers privilege nor denies opportunities. That's our goal. Our commissioners include our chair, Jennifer Jones Austin, our vice chair, Henry Garrido, Kay Bain, Ana Bermudez, who I know, Reverend Fred Davey, Lori Daniel Favors, Derek Hamilton, Chris Quee, Yesenia Mata, and Joanne Yu. The ideas we hear from today's panelists will be considered by the Commission for charter changes and will certainly inform how we think about final recommendations. In inviting today's panelists, the Commission sought to get a variety of perspectives and experiences. The Commission wants to be challenged to think outside the usual frameworks. Today is a panel discussion which serves as a listening session for commissioners to hear ideas from thought leaders in the field and engage with them in questions and answers, but it is not a forum for commissioners to debate, discuss, or come to decisions about the ideas we hear today. This is distinguished from a commission meeting, a formal public meeting at which commissioners do engage in debate and deliberation and make decisions. And I think we're having one of those tomorrow night. With that, I want to introduce or reintroduce our Executive Director, Anusha.
Thank you so much, Deputy Mayor Thompson, for the introduction. Again, my name is Anusha Venkatraman, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Racial Justice Commission. You are right, Deputy Mayor and Commissioner. Our next public meeting of the Commission will be tomorrow afternoon or evening. That is September 14th at 4:30 p.m. You can tune in and watch our proceedings, watch our discussion as a commission through this same YouTube channel. We welcome you to do so. The commission meets at least monthly, and we welcome any members of the public to tune in if we're meeting virtually and join us in person if we're meeting in person. With that, I will move us towards our very exciting panel today. I will first introduce the first three panelists that we have on this first panel, and then talk just very briefly about our format here. So first we will have Elisa Crespo, she, her, who serves as Executive Director of the New Pride Agenda. Born and raised in New York City, Elisa is a product of public schools and public housing. Elisa is a trans Latina, an advocate and activist who has fought unapologetically to preserve the affordability and accessibility of our city's higher education system, to promote civic engagement and voter awareness, and to elevate the LGBTQIA community. Elisa was listed in the Public Advocates magazine's 2021 LGBTQ Woman of the Year list and City and State's 2021 Pride Power 100 list. Congrats. She currently sits on the board of directors of the Hedrick Martin Institute and is the executive director of the New Pride Agenda, a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. Welcome, Elisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And next on our panel, we will have Brittany Wilson, who serves as the Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Civil Rights and Disability Justice Clinic, New York Law School, uses she, her pronouns. Brittany, prior to joining New York Law School, Professor Wilson was a staff attorney at the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. Born with cerebral palsy, Professor Wilson has written and spoken extensively about disability, the intersection of race and disability, for various outlets, including The Nation magazine, Long Reads, This American Life, NPR, PBS NewsHour, Color Lines, and the Huffington Post. Welcome so much, Brittany.
Thank you for having me.
And last on our first panel will be Ashley Sawyer, Senior Director of Campaigns at Girls for Gender Equity, who uses she, her pronouns. Ashley Sawyer, as I mentioned, currently serves as the Senior Director of Campaigns at Girls for Gender Equity, which is an intergenerational organization committed to the physical, psychological, social, and economic development of girls and women. Prior to joining Girls for Gender Equity, Ashley was a staff attorney at Youth Represent. Ashley holds a bachelor's in political science from Rutgers and a JD from Howard University's School of Law. Welcome to Ashley. So on the format, we'll have Elisa, Brittany, and Ashley present in that order for up to 8 minutes each, after which commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists and engage in Q&A. We will be timing you and we'll give you some warning in the chat when you are getting close to your time. And apologies, you actually have a little bit more time today since we have a panel of 3 instead of the usual 4. So you'll have up to 10 minutes. So welcome you to keep your remarks brief so we have more time for discussion, since that's where we get into much of our productive engagement. So with that, I will turn it over to Elisa Crespo.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Elisa Crespo. I'm the Executive Director of the New Pride Agenda, a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization in the state of New York. And we focus on the most marginalized members of the queer community, which are queer youth, at-risk youth who may be runaway or homeless youth, LGBTQ elderly folks, as well as Black and Brown, trans, and gender nonconforming people. What I would like to center in this conversation with the 10 minutes that I have are a number of things, but most importantly, the need for economic justice and economic rights in the city of New York, particularly as it pertains to transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. A lot of people don't understand the deep inequities and segregation that exists in the LGBTQ community. And it's hard for folks in New York to understand how surviving in New York can still be very difficult for the most marginalized members of the LGBTQ community, which I sometimes refer to as the queer community as an umbrella term. I will use interchangeably throughout my minutes of speaking. Something I have been proposing for quite some time now is a public option for employment, otherwise known as a targeted hiring program for vulnerable members of our city. And it doesn't just include LGBTQ people, it includes Folks that are living in zip codes where under the federal poverty level, it would include the formerly incarcerated, the homeless population, seniors, people with mobility issues, at-risk youth, youth coming out of foster care. Income inequality is probably one of the most pressing issues that we are facing in this city, which happens to be one of the most expensive and most unequal cities across this country. And so there are plenty of people who need work, and there's a lot of work to be doing. And so we often look towards the private sector for employment, but the private sector is one tool in our toolbox. I think that we have to look at how, as a city government, we can provide economic prosperity and justice to those who need it the most. And what that would look like would be a public option for employment. Some people may call it a jobs guarantee. There are different ways of putting it, but there are so many things that we can do to put people to work in this city. I mean, we can put people to work in a new industry of green infrastructure jobs. It can be a park ranger position. It could be a clerk in a municipal aid agency. The possibilities, I believe, are endless. And this is not a unthought of program. It's something that currently the city of Los Angeles is already doing and has been doing for a number of years, essentially guaranteeing a job to those who are most marginalized and most impacted by income inequality. I'd also would like to talk about the inequity and the disparities that we have in our public monuments across our city. I understand that a number of months or years ago, there was an initiative for the city to build more statues and monuments of femme figures and women figures of color. And we have yet to have any monuments even considered for transgender icons, namely Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were largely responsible for igniting and setting off what we all know as the Stonewall riots in 1969, right here in the city of New York. And so these are icons that deserve to be remembered and deserve for young people who are coming up in this city to see them as influential role models and figures that they can look up to. So I want to encourage the Racial Justice Commission to consider how we may be excluding certain members of certain marginalized communities in our public monuments throughout our city. I'd also like to take a moment or two to talk about racial justice as it pertains to our local law enforcement here in the city of New York. Currently, the way that the Civilian Complaint Review Board operates is such in a way that is not independent. And I think a number of advocates for quite some time have been calling for an independent and an elected Civilian Complaint Review Board that can take action and perhaps disciplinary measures if possible or when necessary, including the termination of officers who may be accused and found to be guilty of police misconduct and brutality. We've heard about this throughout the summer of 2020, and I think it's fitting to bring up here in this forum, and that is the need for our city to divest from over-policing communities of color and instead reinvest those funds into critical social service programs. A lot of the crime that happens in the city of New York, as you know, is poverty-related crime. So it would serve us well as a city to get at the root of some of the crime that is happening throughout our city and throughout the pandemic, and invest in our communities in such a way that is proven, all of the major studies show would reduce crime. We have a national public health crisis with Black transgender women being murdered and having their bodies violated against by others. We are well behind the curve when it comes to having some of our violence interrupter groups and our cure violence groups, having conversations with these folks about what it looks like to go into communities and talk to folks about gender expression and identity and how we can all live amongst each other free of violence. We tend to forget that there are already tools in place that we can use that can help bring about safety for marginalized groups such as trans people of color. And so I want to encourage the Racial Justice Commission to have conversations with stakeholders and folks who are part of cure violence groups, and begin to think of what a curriculum would look like, where folks are, again, going into the hood, going into NYCHA and talking, because let's be very honest and transparent here. It is mainly Black and brown men who are killing mainly Black and brown transgender people. And so how do we move away from some of these, the stereotypes that we have, and actually have these young people talk to their community members about, and saying, look, we may not agree with people's lifestyles, but we have to respect people. And if you see something you don't like, look the other way. So again, I want to double down and say that the Cure Violence and the Violence Interrupter programs would be better served if we not only attack or dismantle gun violence and gang violence, but if we actually ask these people to talk about identity and protecting one another. And finally, I'd like to use my time to talk about ending the punitive disciplinary actions in our public schools, such as suspensions, which mainly are targeting Black and brown children in our public schools. We need to consider solutions instead of suspensions. And when I talk about divesting from over-policing communities of color, that funding, that revenue saved would be better purpose in hiring more guidance counselors, in hiring more psychiatrists, in more arts programs, which are proven to reduce all kinds of things that cause disruptions in schools. Using the funding to have financial literacy in our schools and better eating habits. There's so many things that we can do to innovate our public schools and to really center those who we've left behind, which is students with disabilities and Black and brown students. And again, just want to reiterate what I started off saying in the beginning of my testimony, which is that New York has been at the forefront of centering LGBTQ rights as a city and state priority, but we have failed Black and brown, trans and gender non-conforming queer people in this city. And we must do something to provide economic justice and rights to them. And that can be a part of a targeted hiring program or a local jobs guarantee program. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for your remarks. Next, we will hear from Brittany Wilson.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So I am Brittany Wilson. I'm very newly a law professor, the director of the new Civil Rights and Disability Justice Clinic at New York Law School. I'm a civil rights attorney. I'm also a native New Yorker, born and raised in Brownsville, Brooklyn. I practice mostly in federal courts though, and most of my advocacy has to do with federal courts. So actually when I was first contacted about this commission, I was very honest. I was like, I don't know very much about New York City law, the city charter. And for that reason, I'm going to talk more broadly from my experience in advocacy and as a New York City resident, just about ways that I think disability should be included in conversations about racial justice more broadly. And so I spend a lot of time, my whole life and career, really trying to emphasize the intersection of race and disability. The fact is, race and disability are intrinsically linked, dating back to the founding of our nation. When we talk about why people of color were brought to America, it was because of our ability to perform. And so the construction of this country is intrinsically linked to how people are classified according to their physical and mental capabilities, their productivity, and their performance abilities. And so I think that's sort of a a long view, but we see all of these connections to this day. So actually I can piggyback off of things that Alyssa said in terms of employment and the need to focus on the employment of people with disabilities. Every single issue that disproportionately affects people of color in the city disproportionately affects people of color with disabilities. So when you talk about employment, not just employment of people with disabilities, but specifically the employment of people of color with disabilities. I think this particular moment that we're in, a pandemic, is a great moment for us to emphasize the intersection of race and disability, because we're literally seeing the consequences of public health, underlying conditions, and things that we don't necessarily refer to on a day-to-day basis as disability, but we're seeing how those effects play out literally in our society. And I feel like we have anecdotes like when white folks catch a cold, Black folks catch pneumonia, that sort of indicate the understanding of the connection between race and disability, but we need to more explicitly name those connections. And I think that's one of the largest barriers to addressing the needs of people of color with disabilities, not just in New York City, but everywhere, is actually identifying the barriers that people face as disabilities. Who's disproportionately dying of COVID? When we talk about underlying conditions, those are disabilities. We're not calling them disabilities necessarily, but they're disabilities. It's the same thing, in the policing context. I wrote an article for The Nation magazine a few years back about the need to talk about both race and disability when addressing policing issues, because we tend to classify them according to categories, right? We talk about people with mental health disabilities that are killed by police, and then we talk about people of color who are killed by police. But the fact is, there's a huge overlap there. Something like between a third and half of all people of color killed by police are people of color with disabilities. And you can understand why, if you already have one quote unquote stigma associated with you, like race, you wouldn't want to sign up for a second quote unquote perceived stigma like disability. And so again, that sort of gets in the way of how we label who's being impacted by things like police violence. But we shouldn't gloss over the fact that when we talk about who's being killed by police, it's disproportionately people of color with disabilities. I even want to talk about things more broadly, like that we don't talk about usually in the context of race, like transportation. There's a huge advocacy happening right now in the city around the lack of accessibility of the subways, long overdue. I myself, like I said, I'm a native New Yorker. I can't and don't take the subway because they're not accessible. Where I live and where I'm from in Brownsville, there's not an accessible station. I know there's litigation happening around that right now. What I don't think has happened, though, at least not as explicitly as it should be happening, is a discussion of where elevators are located and where they're not. And I would bet you anything that if you were to do that mapping, and I believe the maps do exist, subways are disproportionately not located in low-income communities of color. And why does that matter? Not just from a transportation perspective, when we talk about race and disability, but that connects to employment, right? How do you get to your job? What are the barriers? When we talk about the barriers that people with disabilities face to employment, it's not just discrimination in and of itself, it's access to those opportunities. How do you get to those opportunities? How do you keep those opportunities if you can't get to them? And so transportation justice, disability justice, all of those are things that impact communities according to race and disability. Let me see what else I want to discuss, but I think that there are, because I'm not familiar with New York City Charter, I think that sort of gives me a little bit of space to sort of imagine what I would like to see done. And I think in something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that in the environmental justice realm, there are all these rules that if you're gonna get a permit for something, or if you're gonna build something, you have to consider the environmental impact that it will have on a particular community before you do that. And I would like to see similar rules put in place, similar policies put in place for people with disabilities. anything that you're about to do, how does this impact the disability community? Meaning, how can we make this accessible? How can we make sure that the most amount of people possible have access to a particular space or a particular opportunity? I think, particularly living in the midst of a pandemic, we've seen that a lot of the accommodations that people with disabilities have been asking for decades suddenly became available. Suddenly remote work is an option. People are accessing concerts from home, things that we couldn't even imagine before. We want to see that accessibility preserved. And we want to see that broader, that creative thinking, that quote unquote inclusive thinking by default, right? Because we were forced into that inclusive thinking. We want to see it become a long-term thing. And so I would like for this moment, this moment that we're in, to have broader lasting impact for people with disabilities. So those are sort of my imaginative solutions. I want forethought about how every single action and every single activity impacts or disproportionately impacts the disabled community, especially disabled communities of color. And I want the sort of creative thinking and inclusive thinking that this pandemic necessitated to carry over into everyday life. And this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. But really what's most important is leadership by the most impacted. You know, you can't make these decisions about any aspect of city life without people with disabilities being at the table, being in those rooms and making those decisions, and specifically disabled people of color. And so I think if I had to prescribe broad changes that I would like to see in the city, those would be the ones that I would recommend. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for sharing those with us. Last, we move to Ashley Sawyer.
Thank you again for having me. As stated, my name is Ashley Sawyer, and I work at Girls for Gender Equity. So GGE's celebrated 20 years on September 11th, and we are working at the intersections of race, gender, class, and age, right? So we're an intergenerational organization, meaning that we do our work alongside New York City young people. And while we do city, state, and national work, our home has been Brooklyn since the very beginning of the work. And our founder and executive director, Joanne Smith, often shares the terrible, unfortunate story of how in the first year of GGE's founding, when her work was committed to increasing access to athletics and sports for Black girls and youth of color in Central Brooklyn, a Black girl, 8 years old, was sexually assaulted on her way to school in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And that, of course, changed the direction of Girls for Gender Equity, but it also, I think, put a fine point on the work that needs to be done to make New York City a place of racial and gender equity for all people. So whenever we're talking about race and systemic racism, we talk about that issue through the lens of Black girls, because we sort of follow the model of Black feminist activists, organizers, and scholars who understand that when we put the focus, we, meaning people with power, meaning people who care about justice, when we put our focus on the people who are most marginalized, we have the ability to create more opportunity and more justice for everyone. So when we center an 8-year-old Black girl, we have the opportunity to center people who are marginalized because of their race, people who are marginalized because of their gender identity, because of their gender presentation, because of their age, because of their class, their ability, et cetera. So we just wanted to, sort of help broaden the framework with which we look at and talk about race and systemic racism in this city, and of course, more broadly. So very briefly, I will talk about some of the key areas of GGE's work and our areas of expertise, and invite you all to think about these as areas where we can transform the city and transform the opportunities that are available for young people in this city. So first, I want to talk very specifically about gender-based violence and how gender-based violence specifically impacts young people of color. in New York City, and the ways that it intersects with the criminalization and the lack of educational opportunities for young people. So using gender-based violence as sort of the central point, we see all of these other systemic forms of systemic oppression that create the conditions for gender-based violence. So when I talk about that young Black girl, that 8-year-old Black girl who was sexually assaulted on the way to school, we often talk about how important it was that her school was able to meet her needs and respond to the harm that she experienced. And that points to us the fact that many students attend schools in New York City that do not have qualified mental health professionals or professionals or adults on staff who are able to really meet the needs of students who have experienced harm, violence, and trauma. And we see that as a direct result of the city's lack of investment, particularly in schools that are serving predominantly Black, Latinx, Indigenous students. We see a lack of investment in adults who are helping adults, whether they are greeting students at the door with love and with care, professionals who are licensed in social work, and adults who don't necessarily have the professionalization skills, but who have the ability to provide care and support for students. We know that the city has spent each year $451 million per year on school policing. And so as an organization that's Black-led and that centers Black girls, we understand that the resources that are being dedicated to arresting students, punishing students, disciplining students, and I'm putting discipline in quotes, those resources are resources that are not allocated towards creating healing-centered schools. And I'm happy to share more resources about the work of the Healing-Centered Schools group, and also the work that we've been doing for years to build school environments that focus on addressing and responding to young people's social, mental, and emotional needs. Then when we also look at school-based sexual harassment and assault, a few years ago, GGE was able to partner with organizations across the city and of course, New York City Council to advocate for the hiring of 7 new Title IX coordinators who would be responsible for preventing and responding to school-based sexual harassment, which Black girls experience at higher rates than other groups of students. And so it's something as simple as, but as harmful as a game of quote unquote booty tag, and the ways that Black girls, when they fight back against unwanted sexual contact, are statistically more likely to be suspended, expelled, or punished for speaking up, fighting back, or letting someone know that they were inappropriately touched. We know obviously that the city just recently settled a lawsuit on behalf of 4 girls of color who also had disabilities, who were sexually assaulted in New York City schools and whose needs were not met, and who were met with adults who told them that the sexual abuse that they experienced was just a result of flirting or traditional adolescent behavior. That is unacceptable. And we know that that issue is happening not just because of the girl's gender or those young people's gender, and not just because of their race or the fact that they had individualized education plans. It's all of those things happening at the same time. The young people who have special education needs, the young people whose gender identities are marginalized, queer and trans young people, those are the young people who experience racism in a specific and unique way. And what we want to point out is that it is impossible to address any of these isms by themselves. The work has to be done through an intersectional analysis. I know that people throw that term around, intersectional, all the time and do not know what it means, and they've never heard of Dr. Kim Crenshaw, but I want to continue to put the onus on this commission to think about ways that we address systemic racism, looking at all of the systems, how they interact at the same time. And I think of, looking at Black femmes and Black girls as a perfect place to talk about all of those systems. If you're gonna center a Black trans girl with disabilities, you end up addressing multiple issues all at the same time. Really briefly, I have to make an emphasis on the ways that young people in this city have also been disproportionately impacted by sexual violence at the hands of police. Statistically, and I want to give credit to to Professor Andrea Ritchie, whose scholarship is leading in this field, but statistically, the people who experience sexual misconduct at the hands of police are more likely to be young adults. Young adults and trans young people are the most vulnerable to unwanted sexual advances from police, NYPD specifically, and most vulnerable to feeling forced or coerced into sexual acts in exchange for not getting a summons or ticket. And obviously I'm speaking to some degree, not just from my role as Senior Director of Campaigns at GGE, but also from my role as someone who used to represent young people, particularly girls and femmes, who were facing criminalization in this city. And this is before Raise the Age, when I was seeing 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds on Rikers who I saw be harmed and assaulted by police who were in their community and in their schools. This year is the 5-year anniversary of the availability of data around school policing in schools. And GGE just published a report called 40,000 police interventions. And that's 40,000 times that young people had an interaction with school police. And that does not mean that it always ended in an arrest or juvenile record. Sometimes those interactions were just enough to cause harm or just enough to make the student feel as if school was not a place where they were welcome or where they would be supported or encouraged. And when we look at race, Black girls made up 57% of all school police interventions, 57%. Yet Black girls are only 22% of the girls in public schools in New York City. So clearly the disproportionality is evident and it's obvious and it's been right in front of our face. But what's important to keep in mind is I think underneath some of the statistics there is a faulty, and I want to place emphasis on faulty, assumption that Black girls or Black youth are more prone to misbehavior, more prone to disruption in schools. And that is just not true, and it is not backed by evidence. The overrepresentation of Black girls and youth of color in school discipline and in police interventions is a result of targeted policing and the belief, quite frankly, that students of color are quote unquote violent or bad. And so they're more likely to be interacted with and to be approached and to be criticized. And the phrase that people use all the time is if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So every behavior, whether it's laughing and having joy or walking down the hall, bouncing a basketball, every behavior is seen as misconduct, real or perceived. And so for this commission to be effective, there has to be a great deal of emphasis placed upon the decriminalization of New York City schools and the decriminalization of our communities. We know that that schools can be a flashpoint for so much of the harm and violence, racialized harm and violence that young people experience in this city. And I'll just share 2 quick anecdotes. One from when I was an attorney representing young people in this city, helping them mitigate the harm created by our criminal legal system. I met a young person who was dragged out of their school by school cops for something that in today, 2021, would no longer have been illegal. And that student, the consequences of that student being dragged out, placed onto Rikers at 16 are going to be felt by that young person for the rest of their life. And at that point, we have to recognize that all of our systems are failing when we consistently see Black girls and femmes represented in all areas of our city's measurements. And very quickly, one more thing before I close about schools, I also want to place emphasis on the ways that schools police Black girls and Latinx young people's bodies at school through dress codes. New York City still does send students home, whether they document it or not, for wearing clothes that adults deem to be inappropriate or adults find uncomfortable. And we know that the onus of those disciplinary interactions falls on Black and Latinx girls disproportionately. They are more likely to be told that their bodies are quote unquote inappropriate or too sexual, so on and so forth. And we have heard from administrators and staff within the Department of Education that some schools and principals think that the best way to prevent sexual harassment is to tell girls to cover up more. That is rape culture and it is unacceptable. But we know that we cannot talk about creating schools that are healing and supportive for all young people and all girls if we're not centering Black girls and the young people who are most marginalized by all of our city structures. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and to all of our panelists. We're now excited to move to the Q&A portion of our panel here today. So I will ask if Commissioners Bermudez or Commissioners Thompson have any questions for our panelists.
I don't have a specific question in a way because, and just to tell you, the part of the reason is that one, I agree with most of what everybody's been saying, all of it. And also it's come up in other panels, right? So we've been paying a lot of attention to the criminalization and the sort of surveillance culture that exists among even agencies and structures that are supposed to be supposedly helpful, right, to others. Same with policing practices. So right now what we're thinking about is how do we activate those, right, into the charter, right, and in a way that becomes a bedrock of that Constitution. So I wanted to thank all three of you because you have raised very important issues that we're definitely grappling with. Brittany, as you said, mentioned the interactions between police and, individuals who have a combination of their race and disabilities and so on and so forth, and are disproportionately represented in fatalities, is something that we really need to deal with. And we hope to find a way, in the work that we're doing. So thank you, all of you. And if I have a question as I'm thinking, but I mean, I have lots of questions, in terms of a dialogue, but in terms of like focusing this on the charter, is sometimes a little harder, so I'll leave it at that for now, and want to thank you again.
I enjoyed all the presentations. I already asked the Mayor Office for People with Disabilities to produce a map of accessible subways with race and ethnicity in neighborhoods. I thank you so much.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah. My mom had a disability since 1965 until she passed away in 2016. And inability to use the subway is just like, it's just infuriating, and it's been so long, there's no excuse for it. But thank you so much for that. I also love the idea of a public option for employment. Some of us have been trying to get state legislation passed that would require that 30% of everyone they hire has to come from NYCHA or neighborhoods with 15% higher rates of poverty. I'm very hopeful that the state legislature will take it up. But this is something that I couldn't agree more. We cannot rely on just the public sector, the private sector, on their own goodwill and conscience, employing folks. And the way our system works, if you don't have access to a job, you're in deep trouble. So thank you so much for that as well. All three presentations are actually great. I do know Kim Crenshaw. We were college classmates, but yes, but I still struggle with how to implement. What does it mean to implement intersectionality? Like, particularly when the law doesn't recognize intersectionality. It's something I really struggle with. So Ashley, if you have any further thoughts or suggestions on how to come at that in public policy, I'd love to hear it.
Thanks for that question. I appreciate it. Obviously, I think there are scholars who spend their whole day thinking about how do we implement an intersectional analysis. So I will not step on their toes or speak out of turn. But I do think I would implore this commission to think about how do all of city agencies, to the extent that city agencies are capable of responding to some of the issues that we've raised on this panel, how do they do those things together? I think when we say that this one commission or one agency is going to address a systemic issue that reaches across many identities, we're always going to miss the mark. we're always going to leave people out when we try to say, like, we're just focusing on race, or we're just focusing on gender, or we're just focusing on class or disability, because truly it's just not possible to sort of parse a person out and say, just your transness is what we're going to focus on now, and not the fact that, you know, you live in a community that is under-resourced and does not have funding, or that's just not possible. And so to the extent that government can be thinking about more collaboration, that is an opportunity to think about these issues through an intersectional lens. And again, I definitely think that there are scholars who could talk about this way better than I could, but if we're going to talk about racism, why not talk about racism and how a Black trans girl with disabilities is impacted by racism? And when we start there with that person in mind, then we start to realize that that is, I think, one of the ways that we can approach an intersectional analysis. But certainly, you know, I am still not the right person to answer that question with all of the fullness that it deserves.
Right, and I wanted to say I agree with Ashley, but this is also partially why I mentioned the environmental example. It's just a hypothetical, and it's something I've been thinking about just based on some work that I've been doing lately. But you know, this notion of an environmental impact statement where you are forced to analyze the impact that your actions are going to have on a disadvantaged community before you can take that action. Why can't we do that across demographic areas? And just the way Ashley was saying, why don't agencies come together to address systemic issues? Why don't those same agencies study the impacts or think about the impacts that their actions are going to have on specific groups across the board before they implement policies or plans? I think that's one way to get at an intersectional approach to some of these problems.
That is absolutely an idea that we have heard even in other panels. And I will say that if there are folks' work that we should be looking at or other people we should connect with, do let us know. We're closing out this phase of engagement, but we will have months more to come of engagement, and we want to make sure we're drawing on the best work and looking at and engaging the stakeholders, the organizations, the advocates, the activists, the practitioners who are doing this work in their communities, because we certainly need to look to them. And to that end, I'm wondering if you know of any other cities or any other places that are truly taking an intersectional approach to racial equity. Is there any precedent that is out there?
I believe that it exists. It's not coming to mind, but I don't doubt that there are, you know, projects happening where folks are looking to address issues in intersectional ways.
And if I understand Brittany's suggestion, it's not an equity statement saying, in retrospect, saying, here's what, you know, happened when agency X did this to this community or that community. You're suggesting something like a racial justice impact statement that would happen before.
Before, yes, that's in the
Right.
environmental context, you know, but my understanding, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm learning about it. Before you do something, before you can take a particular action, you're required to assess the impact that it's going to have on especially on disadvantaged communities. And my question is, why can't we do the same thing across demographics?
Thank you, that's interesting.
Certainly.
I will mention that one thing we've spoken about a little bit on the commission, also my other hat in the administration, until recently, until 3.5 years ago, we collected data on MWBE programs. It was minority and women business enterprises. So women was a catch-all category that predominantly was white women. And so we actually had no idea how women of color, how they were performing, whether they were getting contracts or not. And when we broke out the data, it was like remarkable. I think over 30% of the contracts were going to white women, Latina women were getting around 2%, and Black women, same thing. Asian women, maybe same 3, maybe, but the disparities were incredible. And so one of the things now we've talked about some is how do we change that? Because the way people are categorized, some people disappear. And I take it when you were saying start, Ashley, with a person, trans, disabled, Black woman, take cases that embody all these different categories and then build out from there as a methodology. I appreciate that. I just wanted to mention we're encountering these problems in city programs already. Big time.
Elisa, I have a question for you on the jobs guarantee proposal that you spoke to, or targeted local hiring. Can you share a little bit more what that would look like? The charter speaks a little bit to how agencies should do hiring or make hiring opportunities available, but I'm wondering if you could share what that would look like and how we could make that as transformative as possible.
Right, thank you. So I put a link in the chat that will, if you click it, it'll show you a very visual blueprint and infographic of how the city of Los Angeles has implemented their local targeted hiring program, as they call it. But essentially what they have done is they have eliminated the civil service exam for certain populations, particularly the ones that are covered in this program, because we know that the civil service exam with respect to public or municipal jobs is in and of itself a barrier for marginalized communities to be able to get into the municipal workforce. And so again, this is a program that provides public jobs, city service jobs, which have all sorts of benefits and pensions and a lot of things that most private sector jobs no longer have these days. But it sets aside specific positions, civil service positions for veterans, individuals with disabilities, transgender individuals, formerly incarcerated, homeless folks, disconnected youth, and people who live within specific zip codes where there may be high poverty levels. And so I think that, frankly, the city of Los Angeles has done the work for us and even has meeting minutes where they have come to, where they have brought municipal union groups to the table and have signed memorandums of understanding. So I would very much suggest that folks from your team take a look at that program and see how it could be implemented here in our city. I think on a charter level, we need to really look at economic rights and what it looks like to have that spelled out in our charter. That residents of the city of New York have a right to be employed. But really that's for your expertise to figure out how to implement.
Thank you so much. I think as we've gone through our public input and these panels, some of the most interesting input comes from folks that are like, well, I don't know everything that's in the charter, but here's something that's really meaningful that could be there. So thank you so much for sharing these thoughts and for sharing the example of what LA has done. Commissioners Bermudez or Thompson, do you have any other questions?
I don't, but I will definitely follow up in my other hat on the LA example. I'm sorry Henry Garrido wasn't here to hear this. This is something he's head of DC 37. This is something he's very interested in as well. So thank you so much for that.
Great. Well, I will ask one more question. One of you, and apologies, I'm not sure which one, spoke about healing-centered schools. I see Ashley nodding, so it was probably you. Are there any examples that you can share of schools either in New York City or elsewhere that have centered this, or even school systems? And if not, what would that look like on a systemic level?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. And I'm dropping into the chat. I don't know how folks can access this, but I'm dropping in the Healing Centered Schools Task Force. And this is coming from Legal Services of New York City in partnership with the Public Advocate's Office and a number of organizations across the city that were working to launch a response. And this came up as a result of obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. And the thought process was, what are the ways that schools can provide young people with the things that they need to be successful? And success is defined, with emotional wellness. And I'll also drop the executive summary into the chat. And, you can, I don't know the best way to get this to the other commissioners, but in short, GGE has articulated something like this back in 2017 with our Schoolgirls Deserve report. But other people can point out the specifics of it, but one of the things are emphasis on mental and emotional wellness, social emotional learning, restorative practices throughout schools. Many people think of restorative justice as just getting in a circle after harm has happened, but in reality, restorative practices cannot work if they are not school-wide and they are invested and embedded into a school well before any harm has happened. Really, it's about building relationships, building community, building trust. There's a number of research that says that young people are less likely to engage in harmful behavior if they feel like they're in an environment where they're cared for. I saw this also through community schools, and the resources for creating community schools are, and scaling it up and in mass at the city level are not available because they're tied up in other ways that we punish and try to exclude students. So I would highly encourage everyone to look at the work of the Healing Centered Schools Task Force and thinking about the work that's been done in some of our community schools as opportunities for us to address systemic racism, gender-based violence, transphobia in our schools.
Actually, on that point, because that is a passion of mine, restorative justice is my middle name, I always say, that if I can ask our staff and the commission to look at or give us a sense of the amount, rate, I don't know of community schools in the hardest hit COVID communities, for example, or communities of color, because I think, as Brittany said before, when you look at, accessible subways, where might they be located, generally speaking, right? So same thing, there was a big push in our own administration, DM Thompson will know this too, of increasing in community schools. Well, where did we increase them ultimately, right? And where are they not as prevalent and in much need, right? And I couldn't agree with you more. I get very scared about implementation of restorative practices in schools when it's seen only as a disciplinary tool, as opposed to a community building and a way in which to really have people be an inclusive and supportive environment, which then ties to what Elisa was saying before about young people in schools being essentially criminalized the moment they step in because the first person they see is a safety agent, right? So anyway, thank you all for all of this. This is great, and we'll definitely pursue a lot of what you've given us today.
Absolutely, and we welcome you to share any written thoughts that you have with us afterwards, as well as any resources. I want to thank you all for sharing all the resources, links to what other cities are doing and work that your organizations have done. Please continue to do so. We have a few more months of work to do. They will be quite intense, and we may return back to you. In particular, we're thinking about the rights of New Yorkers that should be guaranteed in the charter, and whether there's anything that we can do as a commission to strengthen those, and what values do we want to make sure are articulated in the charter. So in particular, welcome any thoughts on that in follow-up. unless any of you have any burning thoughts or closing remarks, I think we can go to a short break before our next panel.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will take a quick pause here and stay on screen while we take about a 3-4 minute break to switch out our panelists, and we will be right back. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you back from our break. I welcome our commissioners and our panelists to turn your cameras on when you're ready. Wonderful. It looks like we have our panelists here, or at least 2 of our 3 panelists. Our third panelist will be joining us shortly and will be the last to present on this panel. Very excited to have you both here today. I will go ahead and introduce you for our commissioners, as well as for the public that are joining in on YouTube right now. I'll read your bios for all 3 of you, and then we'll have you present in the order in which I share your bios before we move to our Q&A with commissioners. All right. Well, I am very pleased today to welcome Pavitra Benjamin, Maimuna Day, and Beverly Tillery. Welcome to the three of you, two of you who are with us already. A little bit about our three panelists. Pavitra Benjamin is a builder, an organizer, and a parent. She immigrated to the US from Nepal with her parents when she was 7. A supporter of Adhikar since 2010. Pavitra has served as a board member since 2014 and began as executive director in 2017. She brings to Adhikar strong and diverse alliances, seasoned and developed over the last 25 years, blending an intersectional approach to race, class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity. Welcome, Pavitra. Next, we have Maimuna Day. Maimuna Day is the program manager in African Communities Together, their New York office, where she leads their community interpreter program, supervising the development of their African language services worker cooperative and managing ACTS. I believe that's the acronym for your organization, advocacy to address occupational licensing issues faced by African hair braiders. Welcome, Maimuna. And last, we will be joined by Beverly Tillery. Beverly is the executive director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, an organization that works to address and end all forms of violence through organizing and education and support survivors through counseling and advocacy. She has nearly 3 decades of experience working in social justice movements. And most recently, she was a deputy director of education and public affairs at Lambda Legal. And before we move into your presentations, you perhaps did not hear my introduction at the beginning, but for your awareness, I'm Anusha Venkatraman, and I serve as the executive director of the Racial Justice Commission. So welcome to our panelists. We're so excited to hear from you. You will have up to 10 minutes to present. We welcome you to take less time than that if you need. And leave more time for Q&A with our commissioners, which we'll do after all three of you have had a chance to present. So with that, we will go ahead and move to Pavitra Benjamin. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. My name is Pavitra Benjamin. I'm the executive director of Adhikar. For those of you that don't know, Adhikar is a worker center and a community center based out of Woodside, Queens. We serve the Nepali-speaking community, which includes people from Nepal, Bhutan, Tibetans who may speak Nepali, but also folks that could hail from India as well. We have about 5,000 members and support about 10,000 people a year. And we work on immigrant rights, workers' rights, healthcare, and language justice issues. I think one of the main things that I want to emphasize in the testimony today is to really look at an intersectional approach of talking about racial equity as we talk about immigration, language justice, and workers' rights issues. I think for me, my whole life has been intersectional, and one of the key things that Adhikar is that we really serve and organize individuals as whole people. And when you take a person as a whole person, our lives often are very intersectional. We are not just coming to the table as a queer person or an Asian person or as a woman or whatever it may be. We're often coming as our whole selves. And for us, working with our members, we often approach our work and our members as whole individuals, whether they have families or are single elderly women that are domestic workers. We're looking at the issues they embody as a whole, which is why we have these broad range of issues. So we'll support people in getting their health insurance card, as well as helping getting their health insurance cases, their legal issues on immigration, as well as their issues around workers' rights issue. So it is really important to us that we actually look at the totality of somebody versus just one issue that they deal with. And I think that's the key in terms of anything that the city does in the city charter in thinking about racial equity and intersectionality. I think for us, we at Adhikar, we're doing everything from legal services and casework and health and safety trainings and workforce development issues to political education, organizing, and advocacy on the systematic issues that impact our members every day. I want to start by focusing on language justice, as that's a key issue that we work on. Everything that we do incorporates language justice. And I would say if there was one defining thing that we at Adhikar really serve for our community, it is around language justice. I mean, we do a lot of work on workers' rights and immigration justice, but everything that we do has to incorporate a language justice lens. We are not just serving the broader Nepali community. We're serving, again, a Nepali-speaking community, often who are low income and workers in informal industries. And in doing that, we really have to think about, when we're thinking about racial inequality, we're thinking about immigration, we're thinking about where is it that folks come from, right? What kind of education do they have, both in their home countries as well as in the US? What kind of language accessibility have they had? Even a lot of the folks that we work with aren't necessarily all predominantly Nepali speaking, meaning that whether they're from Nepal or India or another place, their main language might have actually been an indigenous language or another language. So Nepali may be actually their second language. And so when we're talking about translating or interpreting information like know your rights or legal rights or other issues, we're really thinking about how accessible is the translations and the interpretations. One of the main issues that we've worked with the Mayor's Office on Immigrant Affairs about is really working with them in their Nepali translations. We've gotten a lot of complaints from our members that when they call 311, they cannot access the language that their interpreter is telling them. They're speaking at a much higher level than the language that our members speak. They're speaking often a language that is very that a lot of more highly educated individuals speak. And often it's not interpreted in terms of context, it's interpreted in terms of word by word sometimes. And so we've had a lot of back and forth with the city's interpretation and translations to say context is important, and then using words that a more general population understands is really important. And so for us, one of the main things when we're talking about racial equity is that we also are thinking about language again and thinking about accessibility in language. For us, when we're looking at the Nepali speaking community, we're not looking at our community as a homogenous community. We're looking at the difference of ethnicities, the difference in education levels. We're looking at the differences in terms of caste. We're looking at all these different issues and how folks come to the table, and therefore their ability to understand the issues. And I think therefore we have to think about language justice in a deeper sense when we're thinking about racial equity issues. For example, during COVID, we spent a lot of time at Adhikar doing video series that also had Nepali ASL interpretation, so different form of sign language, not ASL, but different form of sign language, so that folks that didn't could not read Nepali could also understand what was happening with COVID, what the city regulations was, what the state regulations was, what the rules was, where testing was, where they could get the vaccines. We did a 12-part video series in terms of all the things that were happening within the city and the state so that the whole community understood what was happening during COVID. I think just generally, when we're thinking about resource development, we're often thinking in that way. And I want to say that it's really important for then the city to think about the amount of resources that's going towards interpretation and translation. We're not in the top 10 languages that are often interpreted for or translated for, but at the same time, we've really pushed the city to make sure there's translations oftentimes and to make sure that translation is accessible, which is one of the reasons that the city does have the Nepali translations at times. But I think that it's really important in thinking both about budget allocations, but the heads of different departments having the resources to translate the materials, and that all departments are doing this in an accessible manner. So that's one of the things that I wanted to raise in terms of the issues that we face. Another one is workers' rights. I think that really, like, when we break down racial equity issues, we have to, of course, connect it with class, and we have to connect that with workers' rights issues. For us, we're working with a lot of individuals who are in informal industries, those that may not be represented by unions. And so when we're thinking about workers' rights, it can't be just thinking about how to work with unions, but also how to work with worker centers and those that may represent workers that are not in unionized industries. We're working with domestic workers, nail salon workers, delivery workers, restaurant workers. And I think, again, we're thinking about the diversity of the workers and what they bring to the table as their whole selves. And some of the issues that I want to raise, that we've raised regularly on to to the city for over a decade is around issues of wage theft and discrimination. I think one of the things, whether we're looking at DCWP or the Human Rights Commission, is that when we take cases to the city, it often takes too long. Those departments often aren't resourced at the capacity that we need to be able to take a case, because a case can last more than a year sometimes, and we can actually resolve it faster working with a private lawyer or resolve it faster working with another NGO. And so we're not taking as many cases to the city because of how long the process takes, but also oftentimes there's not an enforcement component. There's not the power of enforcement on workers' rights issues that, for example, the Human Rights Commission may have. And so for us, it's really important to think not just are the laws in place, but one, do people understand the laws around language access? Two, is there enough resources to move cases at a faster pace? And three, is there actual enforceability or enforcement power that the department has in order to make sure that those cases get resolved? Because if we're not seeing those things, then people are not going to report their cases. And so I think that's really important to understand. So we all often choose another route outside of the city for that reason. We're also working with a lot of industries where it's women of color dominant. And so when we're looking at those industries, we're looking at a lot of different, for example, we passed a domestic worker bill of rights in New York State over a decade ago, but there's still a lot of issues for domestic workers. And I think that a lot of that has to do, if we do some data analysis, the fact that this is an industry dominated by immigrant women of color. And then we recently passed Intro 339 at the city level, but that took us much longer than it should have to pass. And we could look at these issues that we're working on right now. We're going issue by issue. So Intro 339 expanded the human rights protections to domestic workers. But we are looking at also other labor protections like paid personal time, retirement benefits, unjust terminations, and other issues that if we don't have a broader systematic approach to these issues, we're going to have to fight them issue by issue, which takes a long time. So I think having a more systematic approach to these labor rights issues, especially for industries that are informal industries, often where the employer just has one or two employees and they may not have to fit into the labor rights protections, is really important and key to look at as well. This is similar to the nail salon industry, which we work in. Even though there was a Bill of Rights that was passed, we're looking at a lot of the same issues around wage theft, around other issues. But we're also looking at issues around childcare, making sure that domestic workers, nail salon workers have access to affordable childcare issues so that they can raise their families. And the one very specific thing about nail salons, we work with a group in California that has really been able to work hand in hand with their EPA. And one of the ways in which we haven't really been able to do as much in New York is to really look at the intersectionality of workers' rights and environmental protections for nail salon industries. I think in the nail salon industry, we're looking at a lot of toxins being used in the workplace, and we don't have the same kind of move in which we are, I know I'm at 10 minutes, I'm almost done, in which we bring in like the EPA into the labor rights world so that we can look at the intersectionality of how people are impacted by the issues. The last piece I'll say, and I'll be done very shortly, is around immigration. I think that one of the things that we're constantly facing is those that have temporary protected status, TPS, are constantly having to use the Federal Register notice as a proof of their EAD or their driver's license. And they're facing blocks at the state level because the state employees aren't educated that the Federal Register notice is a proof of their ability to work or stay in this country. And so that type of education within various departments has been a huge struggle for us, and we constantly have to take that up. And then of course, we're really glad the Excluded Workers Fund passed on the state level, but to consistently think about the fact that undocumented workers are the backbone of New York's economy. And when they are unemployed, there is no protection for them. There's nothing that supports them. And we saw that during COVID, how hard life was for undocumented workers. And we are in full support of also making sure that the NYPD does not collaborate with ICE. So there's no enforcement of immigration by the NYPD. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Pavitra. We will now move to Maimuna Day. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maimuna J, Program Manager at African Communities Together, ACT. So ACT, I lead our community of interpreters program and supervise the development of how African Language Services Cooperative. So African Communities Together is an organization of African immigrants that empowers our community members to integrate socially, get ahead economically, and engage civically. We are glad that the chapter commission is looking for ways to better incorporate racial equity into the city's chapter. We commend your efforts to do that. As an organization of African immigrants, here are some of the specific equity issues that our African immigrant members and the community we serve face. Looking at intersectional challenges that communities with multiple identities face, we found language access and barriers to MWBE certification to be among the greatest. With regard to language access, ACT and our coalition partners were part of the historic advocacy that resulted in Local Law 30, which is the New York City language access policy that expanded language access to French, Arabic, Urdu, and Polish. Many of our community members we serve at ACT are West African immigrants who speak, in addition to their native languages, French. And this language access expansion meant that about 2,000 more Africans can access city services in French. Although the Local Law 30 is a great start to language access, it does not cover all African immigrants because, as you may know, many African immigrants who are from Francophone countries can communicate most effectively in their native languages instead of French, because French is a widely spoken language by Africans who have access to higher education. With an increase of African immigrants coming from different economic and educational background in New York City, we are faced with two major concerns that Local Law 30 did not address. The first being the challenge of community members face finding interpreters in African languages other than French in city agencies. So our office, similar to what my panelist Pavitra just mentioned, our office often received calls from our new immigrant members who are unable to access city services because they were not able to communicate with city agencies. And a number of them will actually call our office to assist in interpretation. And the other thing is the city is heavily dependent on telephonic interpretation services like Language Line. And we all know that telephonic interpretation is often inferior in building connection and trust between the interpreter and the client. In addition to that, our members and many service providers have raised concerns about the quality and the availability of African languages like Mandingo and other languages of limited diffusion, including indigenous Latin American languages and some Asian languages. We often hear complaints that clients are not connected to interpreters who do not speak their language, or the staff don't even try to obtain interpreters and tell the community members to bring a family member to interpret. This language access problem was made more prevalent in the wake of the global pandemic that we are currently in. Most COVID-related information due to the nature of this pandemic was rapid, instantaneous, and mostly in languages that were not accessible to our community members. In response to this pandemic, ACT conducted a survey to measure the impact of COVID within the African community between May and July. We were able to survey around over 1,040 community members, and the results of the question: did you receive any information from the government about the coronavirus, either health information or resources like unemployment in your language? 55% said no, and another 5% was not sure. And we conducted another survey from July to late August, continuing to ask the same question, and we surveyed an additional 435 community members, and 90% of those said that they did not receive that information in their language. In total, that would be over 65% of our community that did not receive vital information in their language, or they were unaware if there were any attempts to reach them in their language. During the height of this life-threatening pandemic, where thousands of people lost their lives and jobs, only about 35% was given information that could help save them and their loved ones. And if no other time made language access a priority, this should serve as the example as to why this is extremely necessary. In addition, many African languages are spoken languages. They do not have a written form. And right now we are in a high-tech era, and we believe we need to invest in technologies to effectively communicate with hard-to-reach communities by moving into the direction of multimedia, making video messages shared on WhatsApp or Facebook as a form of outreach to these communities would serve a greater function and inclusion. Also providing short videos on city websites instead of being entirely dependent on website text. Is another great strategy to make resources more accessible to limited literacy community members and those who speak languages that are primarily oral. Our partners, we mentioned earlier, so our Asian American Federation, MASA, and New York Immigration Coalition, we have been working tirelessly to address the issue of language access and propose the city to invest in the establishment of a community legal interpreter bank, which is a model that the District of Columbia has successfully used since 2007. And it consists of a group of professional interpreters and translators who are recruited and trained to provide language access services free of cost to qualified nonprofit organizations that serve low-income individuals. We advise the city to consider emulating this model of language access. As of currently, ACT is in the process of incubating an African Language Services Worker Cooperative, which will be a worker-run agency that provides in-person interpretation, translation, and language instruction of African languages and ESL for new African immigrants. We already finished the language testing this summer and the interpreters training for the co-op members, and we are in the process of launching. One important way that the city can help language services co-op succeed is by eliminating some of the legal barriers for them to get New York City MWBE certification. However, in order to receive the MWBE certification, New York City currently requires, and I quote from the website, at least 55% of the business is owned, operated, and controlled by a US citizen or a US permanent resident. As we understand it, this is a barrier that New York City itself imposes, not one that is imposed by the federal law. ACT and many other advocates for MWBEs and worker co-ops have raised this unnecessary barrier with SBS Commissioner Bishop and many other city officials, and we have been told that the city is reviewing this policy with an eye to changing it. However, while we know that the city leadership has been aware of the issue since at least 2018 when we started having this conversation with them, we have not seen any change to this policy in the intervening 3 years. So this rule is an unnecessary barrier to the MWBE certification for community members who are undocumented and should be eliminated. To close, we came up with a few suggestions to address the intersectionality. So intersectionality is not whether the person is who is not fluent in English, but whether the is able to access services, but whether the person, because of their language barrier, is experiencing inequity for not being able to access vital services. And to address this issue, we suggest that the charter to not use census data only, but consider other sources of data, such as the DOE data or the American Community Survey. Going back to local law 30 that I mentioned earlier, the reason why the city was able to increase their city languages to 10 and added those 4 languages was because of the fact that they use DOE data. We need to do better with the data that we have by taking into account the recency of immigration, the recent arrivals, advocate along with the census for the use of the American Community Survey, which asks the questions of how well do you speak English and what language do you speak at home? These 2 questions are very vital because for my case, when they ask me what language do I speak at home, I will mention Wolof. But in the census, when that question is in the census, when the question is asked, I will also mention French because I speak both of those languages. So this the use of the American Community Survey will better capture the data that we have on multilingualism. And we also noticed the issue of using only census data with the new amended New York State Executive Order of May 2021, which expanded their language access to include Italian and Yiddish. And these are not growing immigrant communities. Instead of using Swahili and Arabic, which were which could have been added if you were to use the American survey community. And another thing that I also wanted to add is there was this report that the city were publishing, which called the newest New Yorkers. It was a report about the data, which collects data about the city's immigrant communities. But unfortunately, that hasn't been updated since 2013. So we need to update that report to better reflect the immigrant community and know which ways we can better assist them in, especially in accessing vital services. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for sharing your testimony with us. We have been joined by our final panelist, who is Beverly Tillery. Beverly, I read your bio earlier. Thank you for joining us, and we're very excited to hear from you now.
Thank you. Thanks for accommodating my schedule today. Thank you to the New York City Racial Justice Commission for holding this panel on intersectionality. My name is Beverly Tillery, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, or AVP. For over 40 years, we've worked to address and end all forms of violence that impact New York's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected communities. We provide direct services and engage in organizing and policy advocacy. We run a 24-hour bilingual hotline, provide free counseling, legal services, as well as training and leadership development programs for survivors of violence. And we collect and disseminate data about the violence experienced by those in our community. And we provide training and technical assistance to agencies, service providers, and others to ensure that they are providing LGBTQ survivors of violence with the support and services they need in a culturally competent way and affirming manner. Our data shows consistently that the violence experienced by LGBTQ and HIV-affected New Yorkers has been and continues to be not only on the rise, but also intensifying, and that those who are most impacted by violence in the LGBTQ community are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. They are transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary. They're immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, low-income folks, and other LGBTQ people who hold multiple marginalized identities. We are in the midst of a crisis of violence, both interpersonal and state violence targeting, in particular, trans and gender nonconforming people in our country. And our city has not been spared from this crisis. Incidents of hate violence are on the rise, even in our city, as we're weekly hearing reports of violence against LGBTQ people, Asians, our Muslim community members as well. And during COVID, many of our agencies saw spikes in domestic violence or intimate partner violence while people were sheltering in place. At AVP, we also saw increases in reports about anti-LGBTQ hate violence incidents from landlords, family members, roommates, neighbors, and others while people were sheltering in place with those who caused them harm. So this conversation about intersectionality is a much needed part of this discussion. I do not purport to be an expert on the city charter, but will share with you some of our thinking about ways that we think the city can intersectionally approach some of the issues of safety and violence for our community members and others as well. So one first suggestion is throughout the charter, whenever possible, we would love there to be explicit language naming the communities that are most marginalized. For instance, instead of just naming a minority group, in some cases, the city charter says minority group members and women. We suggest that the charter really be explicit in naming Black, Indigenous people and other people of color, LGBTQ people, and other minorities. This has been particularly important to make sure that resources and are sufficiently targeting the communities who are most impacted by the issues that you're trying to deal with. And also, whenever possible, we'd also like to see the naming of communities that should be included in task forces and commissions to make sure that those communities reflect the diversity of the communities across the city. When we talk to people about, the root causes of violence and, what are some of the things that can be done by the city to address the violence that they experience, people often talk to us about the fact that they are often criminalized in a lot of different ways. They talk about the lack of safe housing and the lack of employment opportunities and educational opportunities as barriers to them being able to safely live in our city. So in terms of criminalization, this is definitely one of the ways that BIPOC and LGBTQ people are most impacted by violence. We'd like there to be a citywide examination of the ways that communities of color and LGBT communities are impacted by criminalization, and the way that criminalization changes and evolves over time and is changing and evolving. What we find is that we have efforts to address particular parts of criminalization, and then the ways that our communities are criminalized just continues to change and morph. It's not that criminalization is ending, but it looks differently. So, we might criminalize sex workers, but then when we address criminalization of sex workers, people, are impacted by other kinds of loitering laws that criminalize them. So looking at the impact of criminalization and the ways that criminalization is actually specifically affecting communities of color and LGBTQ people. We also hear from people regularly about the ways that they are harmed by police violence with no real mechanisms for accountability. So we'd like the accountability mechanism within the CCRB strengthened beyond just making recommendations. We really need to see systems where both individual officers, but also the NYPD as a whole are accountable for the police misconduct that people are experiencing. Just this year, the Civilian Complaint Review Board issued a report on the police shooting and killing of Kowalski Trawick, who is a member of the LGBT community, who was experiencing a mental health crisis when the police entered his apartment and within 90 seconds of arriving on the scene, had tasered him and shot him and killed him. And the report issued found that there was police misconduct and recommended that the police officers be fired. And we feel like while this is rare that we actually get that kind of a report, again, the amount of accountability that the CCRB actually has to really make sure that those changes are happening is very limited. So we'd like to see that addressed. In employment practices, we think that the Equal Employment Practices Commission should be regularly, again, explicitly looking at not just discrimination in employment, but specifically looking and naming discrimination for BIPOC communities and LGBT community members, in particular, trans and gender nonconforming folks, really naming those marginalized identities and having those reports explicitly look at ways that the city can address that discrimination. And similarly for affordable housing, we think that more communities need to be explicitly named in the city's efforts to address housing. For years, there's been a crisis in the LGBT community around access to shelter beds. And while shelters are notoriously harmful and a source of violence for LGBT community members, when people are rarely able to access them. So we believe that there needs to be LGBTQ specific shelter beds set aside for people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as people who are experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And we think that more efforts need to be made to create affordable housing that's adequate for the city, and that we should be looking at if the private market is not doing enough to create affordable housing, making sure that city dollars are then spent to create housing that's sufficient to house the population that is experiencing homelessness. In terms of public safety, we'd like to see a long-term investment into violence prevention and strategies that are community-based that do not necessarily have an over-reliance on policing, allowing communities to create community-based models for safety that include restorative and transformative justice models for keeping community members safe, similar to the PATH program that is bringing together communities across impacted identities to address hate violence across the city. So those are just some of our thoughts and recommendations around particularly ways that we can look at safety in terms of the charter and do that with an intersectional lens.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your remarks, Beverly, and to all of our panelists. We're now excited to move to the Q&A portion of our afternoon. And I want to put it forth if Commissioners Coy, Bermudez, or Thompson have any questions. I know I do, but we can give you an opportunity first.
Well, I first want to thank all of you for your presentations, because it's like the more we do these, the more very, very significant, consistent themes emerge. You've touched upon them all, in fact, you know, I did not know, for example, about the language in the MWBE application process. Was a little surprised. And so that's something definitely I would like to pursue and look at, you know, further as part of this commission, not just what it's clear you've done a lot of advocacy around this, you know, but maybe there's something that we can look at as well. And in terms of, you know, the complications, if any of you have any thoughts about how do we operationalize through the charter? And I'm not asking for anybody to be an expert on this, but to give us a little help about specifically about language access, being able to, you all put it very, starkly, and it's what happens that you can't, it's very hard to connect with people at a human level through a telephone when somebody is interpreting, right? And so if you have any thoughts about that in terms of operationalizing something along in that vein, we'd greatly appreciate it, for sure. But I want to thank you all, and Beverly also, for I've worked with AVP for many years and throughout my career, so I appreciate also the work that you are doing. So that's what I have to say. Sorry.
Thank you. If any of our panelists would like to respond, feel free to do so.
I don't think I understand the charter system, the charter process enough to say this is how you should operationalize it. But I do think that, what the basics that I understand, it is about process and the different departments within. And I think that if each department actually has sound concepts of what language justice is and how to offer language justice, whether it's translations or interpretation, but also a much more thorough understanding of the 311 and how the language line is used, as well as the other piece that I would look at is who gets contracted to do the 311 lines and how are they doing the interpretation or the translations, right? And the contracts that are being posed in terms of what types of language professionals that they actually have and how they're looking at language in context. I think those are some basic ideas, but I do think it needs to be uniform across departments, and that's one of the inequities that we're seeing. So some very simple idea, again, not a charter expert.
Mm-hmm. I think, taking that one step further, are there ways, within the charter or in anywhere else that we could make that systemic or structural? Some of the challenges you point to may be going agency by agency, but what would language justice look like on a citywide level, writ large, and then it's sort of up to agencies to figure out what that might look like for them.
Yeah, and I also think that maybe Maimuna has some ideas, and I'll jump in after you.
Yeah, I was just mentioning that that's what I was talking about earlier. The city needs to invest in a community legal interpreter bank, because the reason why we are always mentioning that model is that we see that it's been working in DC since 2007. And what they do is they recruit the community, the members from that community who understand the languages, and also because interpretation is not only about the language. For instance, if I speak French and somebody needs to interpret for me who lives in French, we might not be able to understand each other, because there are cultural things that are involved and a lot of other factors. So investing in a community leader and interpreter bank, and also in these language cooperatives, I think will solve the part of the problem, because the reason why a lot of interpreters weren't being able to connect to somebody over the phone is because they don't know who that person is. There's an issue of trust. There's an issue of, this person is from a different region. They might not understand what I'm talking about. So investing in a language cooperative, community language cooperative in African languages, Asian languages, and Latin American languages will help in two areas: language access and also in the workforce area, because you're training the people in the community to be language professionals.
Yeah. And I think very similarly, whether it's a cooperative or organization like Adhikar, folks will come to us because they recognize us and trust us. And so folks go to ACT for the same reason. And I think if you're working and actually putting the resources back in the community organization that already trusted, that you'll go a lot further in terms of the interpretation and translations.
Absolutely. And this might be a related question. It's about data and data disaggregation in particular. On our last panel, we talked a little bit about this in regards to MWBEs. Commissioner Thompson brought it up. I'm wondering to what extent data collection and disaggregation data comes in when we're talking about language justice or even justice related to immigration status. And Pavitra, I know you had a comment on this.
I did. I was like, Chad. I really appreciate that question. It's one thing that I missed earlier on. And I think one of the things that's really important is like when we look at the broader communities of the Black community or the Asian community or the Latino community, there's such a wide variety, especially for us in the Asian community. So you can say, look, a lot of the Asian community, if you don't disaggregate the data, it's easy to say, well, the Asian community is educated and they're well off, or they're this and they're that. But if you're looking at disaggregated data, like if you're looking at the Nepali speaking community, you're not going to get the same statistics there. And so I think it's really important that we look at the variety and the details within communities to really across the board understand how different communities are really being impacted. If you don't have disaggregation of data, I don't think you can do real racial equity work.
And do you believe that needs to happen through the census or through the various ways that the city collects data?
The way I think census is a basic broader indicator, and we worked really hard on census to get some basic data, data. I don't know if it resulted in us getting Nepali people, for example, or Nepali speaking people counted, but at the same time, I think that the city itself needs to do deeper data disaggregation, and the departments across the board need to do it together. It can't be a one department led activity.
Thank you. Any other questions from our commissioners?
I just had a quick question for Maimuna J. That I heard her say, or I heard you say that, that a program required a citizenship, had a citizenship or permanent resident requirement. I didn't hear which program that was.
That's the MWBE. The Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise.
And where is that requirement written?
So if you go, I'll share the link, but if you go to the New York City government website, you will search for Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise Certification Program. They will tell you what the requirements are. And the third point of the requirement is that at least 51% of the business is owned, operated, and controlled by a US citizen or a permanent resident who are women and members of designated community members. I'll share the link here on the chat.
Thank you. And for staff, my question would be whether that's in the state legislation or not. Because the MWB program, the rules are established through the state, largely.
Yeah, absolutely. We can look into that. I have a question. I think it was Beverly that brought this up in regards to criminalization and the ways in which the forms of criminalization may morph over time. How do we address criminalization or over criminalization systemically if the form or the way it shows up is always shifting and changing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really difficult but important thing to address. And, I think part of it has to be, one, the acknowledgement of what is currently happening and ways that communities are disproportionately criminalized, and, ways that laws that seem innocuous or, all about public safety are really, the result is being criminalizing particular communities. So one, I think, is a real willingness to do some of that analysis. And then, there actually has to be a system for it, for that analysis to be happening in an ongoing way, because, and then, like really deep dialogue with communities, because, I think why, having, sort of named representation on some of these commissions and task forces is so important is because, community members always are aware and know, right? So, you know, when we in our organization talk to, you know, trans and gender nonconforming folks, they can tell you in a minute, you know, here are the ways that we are being criminalized. And often it is those laws and policies that on the face of it, most people would agree with. Most people would say, oh, sure. But you really have to kind of look deeply at the ways that homeless people are criminalized, or, you know, poverty in and of itself is criminalized. And then you have to look at what are the disproportionate ways also that those laws are being played out, like stop and frisk was analyzed. You know, we've learned from stop and frisk how to do that kind of analysis. And so I think we have to apply that to other laws and types of criminalization as well, because it's the exact same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. It's sort of looking at particular policy and law and analyzing who's being impacted. It goes back to this question that we were just talking about in terms of data, and really looking deeply at the data. You know, there has to be both the willingness and also the resources to do that work on a regular basis. And then be hearing from communities, and then when communities point out a new way that people are criminalized, or that we hadn't really realized that this community is being overly targeted by a particular law, then there has to be the mechanism to kind of dive in and do that analysis, and get that data so that the adjustments can actually be made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a follow-up question in terms of, you know, you mentioned deep dialogue and engaging communities during decision-making processes. You know, what would that look like practically as policies are being set, even as laws are passed? You know, what would it look like for affected communities to be engaged in, you know, not just a consulting manner or an advocacy manner?
Well, I mean, I do think that there are a lot of organizations that are working directly with, you know, many marginalized communities. And so, you know, I think at a very first level, those organizations have to be tapped to bring the people forward. And, you know, I think that there have been some really effective hearings and, you know, other mechanisms that I've seen city agencies use to hear from people. And I think what we don't often hear is then what comes out of those hearings, where people, you know, give testimony about a particular issue. And I do think that there has to be greater attention to following up and communicating back to people what the result of those, you know, those hearings or whatever those forums are, and really trying to be responsive and having more of a, you know, having that dialogue not just end at that first step, but there have to be more steps to the process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Do we have
and the other thing?
Yep,
one other thing I was just going to say that I didn't say, because I'm sure that it probably came up at some other point, but just in thinking about the organizations that are doing the direct work with marginalized communities, I think there are so many ways that the city, and I'm not sure exactly through the charter, but that the city could make it more possible for people to do their work even more effectively. And one of the things that comes to mind to me is just the funding processes and how both onerous and slow they are in terms of, ensuring that the money gets to organizations in a timely manner, that you don't have to wait a year, that, there's more opportunities for multi-year funding, and that there's more opportunities for organizations to get to really utilize and get more indirect funding, because that indirect funding allows organizations to be flexible in times of crisis. And especially what we saw during COVID was that organizations that had the capacity to respond to people in crisis were often hampered by the constrictions that they were given in whatever the grant requirements were. And if people had just been given the money to do the work that they needed to do, it would have been a lot easier for people to pivot and meet the needs of people on the ground quickly and effectively, without having to worry about trying to renegotiate with the funders and the agencies about, can we do this or can we not do that? That there's a lot that I think the city could be doing to think about how to really allow the organizations to do the work that they need to do.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions for our panel? Panelists, I also welcome you to add anything to the conversation, anything that may be on your mind or that we haven't touched on today. All right, well, looking like we do not have any remaining questions. I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for generously sharing your thoughts, your input with the commission. You're welcome to share written remarks or recommendations with us afterwards as well. We welcome you to do so. Feel free to include any resources or examples that we should look to in there. And we may come back to you as we work through the recommendations that the commission will ultimately put forth. We may have questions for you. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us today and giving your time and your expertise. And I also want to thank members of the public who are tuning in via YouTube. Thank you for watching our panel today on intersectionality, equity across identities. I will note for all that our next public full commission meeting will be held tomorrow afternoon virtually. You can also tune in via YouTube. That's Tuesday, September 14th at 4:30 p.m. And we welcome you to join in. With that, we will close for the evening. Just want to thank you again, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.